So let's begin by developing our motivation for the evening. So we've just been sitting for a few minutes and observing how thoughts are constantly arising in the mind, how they arise, they abide very briefly, and they pass away of their own accord unless we give them energy. Even if we've been meditating for a long time, many years, thoughts continue to arise in the mind. And they're just words, aren't they? They're words and images. Mostly these thoughts come because we've thought that way before. They arise out of habit. And what's interesting about thoughts is that when we're thinking, we're mixing the object with our thoughts about the object. But it appears as if our thoughts are reality, as if our thoughts are true, as if our thoughts are wise, as if our thoughts are sometimes our orders that we must obey. But actually they're just thoughts. They're just thoughts and images arising in the mind due to habit. So it's important that we question the thoughts, to really check, to investigate, to analyze. Are these thoughts actually in accord with reality? Do they accord with reality? Because if our thoughts are actually in line with reality, conventional reality, maybe ultimate reality, then our actions that are motivated by those thoughts will also be in accord with reality and will bring a positive result. And if our thoughts are distorted in some way, including some exaggeration or superimposition, some distortion, then the actions that are motivated by those thoughts will also be distorted and will give rise to results, suffering results. So the Buddha said on many occasions that the mind is the creator of our happiness and our suffering, our liberation and our samsara. And so tonight let's generate the intention that may our thoughts and actions of our body, speech, and mind not become a cause of suffering, but only become a cause of happiness. May our thoughts be in line with reality. And may this intention support our long-term aspiration to accomplish full awakening for the benefit of all sentient beings. So tonight we're beginning a series of reviews, working on review questions while Venerable Choden is away. And we can all rejoice that Venerable Choden is in Taiwan today and in the next couple of days, where she's receiving a Global Bhikshuni Award in recognition for her leadership in the monastic world. So we can all rejoice about that. Tonight we're going back to quiz number 4. Is that online? Is that available to people? Okay, so quiz number 4. Although Venerable Choden has been teaching on some verses in the 400s, I'm not sure which verse exactly we're on, but in our review, we're still on verse in the 80s and 90s. So, but this section that we're looking at is talking about selfless as a person, how we understand selfless as a person and selfless as a phenomena, which is something that we talk about quite often. In fact, we reviewed that pretty thoroughly recently when Venerable was giving teachings on the book that she co-authored with His Holiness, Buddhism, One Teacher, Many Traditions. So part of tonight will be a review, and also it will take us back to looking at some of these early verses that we found in Nagarjuna's precious Garland. So we're beginning with question number 11. And it says, explain why, 1, the person doesn't inherently possess the aggregates. 2, the person is not the collection of the aggregates. And 3, the person is not the arrangement of the aggregates. So these are 3 aspects, or 3 aspects of the sevenfold analysis, isn't it, of investigating the relationship between the self and the aggregates. And so we can just use this as a review. And in fact, I brought out the whiteboard, as I usually do, because there's a nice way that we can look at these 7 analyses in a graphic form that can help us to remember them and to see where they fit. So in the Lam Rim, when we're talking about the sevenfold analysis, especially in the Lam Rim Chimo, it begins by describing, if you're looking at the relationship of 2 things, they're either going to be one or different. So the only way 2 things can be one is if they're exactly the same thing, like pen and pen. Oh, I forgot to ring the bell. Oh well. All right. So if we're looking at the pen and the pen, they are one because they're exactly the same. If we're talking about the pen and the gong, they're different because they're not one, they're not identical. So the same thing is true when we're analyzing or investigating, is something inherently one with something else? Like, is the self inherently one with the aggregates, or is the self inherently different from the aggregates? It's going to be one or the other. So let's just do some review, and I'll bet that most of you can call these up just from memory. But let's look at them in terms of where these 7 types of analyses fall. There will be some that fall under the category of not inherently one, or identical. Sometimes Venerable uses that term. Not inherently one, or not inherently different. So what's the first point of the 7? The self is...
The self is not the aggregates.
The self is not the aggregates. In other words, the self is not inherently one or identical with the aggregates. So obviously that fits under this side, right? Self is not inherently one with aggregates. Okay, and the second one?
They don't exist in it either.
Just a minute, we'll come to that. The self is not inherently different from the aggregates. Okay, what's the third one? Usually in that list of 7. What's the next one?
Yeah, not in the here.
Yeah, the self is not in the aggregates, or the self does not depend on the aggregates. Which side does that go on?
It's not in, so it's not one. It's different.
It's not different. Okay, so number 3 is the self is not inherently different. It does not inherently depend,
Yes.
or doesn't exist on the aggregates. And what's the next one?
Possess the aggregates.
The aggregates do not. And which side does that fit on?
It's inherently different.
The aggregates do not inherently depend or exist in the self. Depend on or exist in the self. All right, what's number 5? The self does not possess the aggregates, or the self does not inherently possess the aggregates. Which side does that go on? Both. How does it go on both?
Because if it's like someone possessing
A car.
a car, then it would be that they're different.
Okay.
And if it's someone possessing their ear, it would be one and the same.
Good. Like a car. Oh, no. Like an ear, you said. So a self possessing an ear is like, the self does not inherently possess the aggregates like someone would possess their ear. And not inherently different is the self does not inherently possess the aggregates like a self-possessing, a person possessing a cow. Is that what you said? A car? A car. I think Sankapa said a cow. Somebody said a cow. Okay, and then that's 5. So 5, isn't that interesting? 3 and 4 on one side, but 5 exists on both sides. Okay, what about number 6? The self is not the collection of the aggregates. And which side does that go on? The self is not the shape, whoops, the collection, yep, the collection of the aggregates. And the last one?
Not the shape, but the arrangement.
The self is not the shape or the arrangement of the aggregates. Actually, I've seen it 2 ways. The self is not the shape of the collection of the aggregates, is often how it's stated. Okay, so. The shape or the of the collection or arrangement. I hope that's helpful. It was very helpful for me to be able to discover those relationships and how they all fall into either not inherently one or not inherently other. Okay, so specifically here in this question, explain why the person doesn't inherently possess the aggregates. The person is not the collection of the aggregates, and the person is not the arrangement of the aggregates. What verse do you think that was referring to? I know we've all been very busy in the last 2 weeks with the teachings that we had, so perhaps we haven't had as much time as we usually would have to go through the verses. I thought it fit with verse 82.
Yeah.
Okay? So verse 82 says, "The aggregates are not the self, nor do they exist in the self, nor is the self in the aggregates, but without them the self cannot exist. And the self and the aggregates are not mixed like fire and fuel. Therefore, how could the self exist?" So this verse is exploring the relationship between the self and the basis of designation, the aggregates. And if the person existed inherently, it should exist in one of these 7 ways. So just as a reminder, these 7 points of analysis, 5 of them were actually mentioned in Sutra. The Buddha mentioned 5 of them. Being inherently different was specifically brought up to refute non-Buddhists who said that the self and the aggregate were actually different, inherently different. And then the other 4, not being one, not being the possessor, not being the support or the supported, were also mentioned in Sutra. And then Chandakirti added the last 2, not the shape, not the collection. Okay. So, again, because we've been through these a number of times, let's just review what are some of the main reasons or supporting reasons or absurd consequences that we could come up with to substantiate that the self is not inherently one with the aggregates.
5 selves.
You'd have 5 selves because you have 5 aggregates. That's one of them. Because if they were inherently one, they would have to be identical in all ways. So if there's 5 aggregates, there'd have to be 5 selves. And conversely, if there was 1 self, there'd be 1 aggregate. Okay, what else?
To say I and my body or I and my aggregates are pretty superfluous because they're the same.
To say I and my body would be...
I can identify the I as separate from any of those things.
Yeah, so to identify the self as separate from the basis of designation, any of the aggregates would be without purpose because they would be identical. So you kind of lose the agent of the actions. It would be pointless. Okay, can you think of other things?
To be one with the aggregates would all have to be identical to each other, and
All the aggregates themselves would have to be...
you can't be identical to 5 things that are identical to each other.
Good point. Okay, so the body would have to be identical to the mind, have to be identical to and all the different aspects of mind that make up the aggregates. I've never read that one before, but it makes sense. Okay, yeah.
When the body dies, the self would not continue.
When the body dies, the self would not continue. That's right, because one of the elements would be, or one of the consequences would be that the self would be subject to arising and disintegrating, wouldn't it? And so, if that's the case, because the aggregates of the life arise and disintegrate, or we could say the aggregates of this realm arise. Like for instance, the aggregates of a human arise at the time of birth, and then they disintegrate at the time of death. And so the self would also have to be newly arisen, newly created, actually, in the first moment of conception, and then also go out and cease at when the aggregates cease. Okay. Anything else come to your mind?
There's something in this one about the karma that the self and the aggregates are inherently one, that the karma doesn't go on to the next life, so we will be experiencing sort of random kind of karma because
Right.
there's not a continuity. Everything, the aggregates and self would exist together, and so when they, at the time of death, there's no continuity of karma, things like that. There's a randomness about it.
That's right.
I'm trying to remember.
Yeah. So something that arises and ceases inherently it can't be a continuum.
Yeah.
So in each moment there's a new self, actually.
Yep.
And so each self, another consequence would be that each moment of the self would be unrelated to the next moment of the self. And so that person would be experiencing things totally unrelated to the selves that came before, and would also be creating karma that would go to waste.
The results in the future.
Yeah, it would either go to waste, or we'd be experiencing things now that we had no connection with. Okay. Now let's look at number 2. The self is not inherently different from the aggregates. What are some of the absurd consequences or reasons that we call to mind for that one?
My body could be here and myself could be in New Jersey.
Wouldn't that be convenient?
It would be.
So the body could be here and the self could be somewhere else, or the mind could be here and the self could be somewhere else. Sometimes it feels like the self is here and the mind is somewhere else, but not inherently. Okay, anything else?
There's no reason to label the I independence from the aggregates. They'd be unrelated.
Right, there's no reason to label the I independence upon the aggregates because they'd be totally unrelated. Okay. There's one more that's often brought up in this section. If you had 3 things, you could label them like a horse, a cow, and a sheep. You can see them each distinctively and label them distinctively. So we should be able to do that with the self, the body, and the mind. But that's not the case because the body and mind are one entity. They're not inherently one entity, but they are one entity. Okay, then the third one, the self does not inherently exist in or depend on the aggregates. This is where we get those analogies. And, right, so we're looking at the self first. The self does not inherently exist in or depend on the aggregates. So the analogy that's given is Because if they did, the self and the aggregates would have to be inherently other, like a lion, that would be like the self, in the forest. So if the self existed in the aggregates like a lion in the forest, they would be unrelated, wouldn't they? That's how we've shown it under not inherently different. The aggregates the self does depend on the aggregates, but not inherently. If it inherently depended, they would have to be unrelated, like a lion in a forest.
You would once again have the thought that when the aggregates cease, the self will cease. The self depends on the aggregates. At the time of death, the self will have no
Yes.
Continuity.
cease.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And then the self, the aggregates do not inherently exist in or depend on the self. And so what's the analogy there?
All the gems in the box.
Yeah. Like yogurt in a bowl or the gems in the box. Gems in the box came from Nagarjuna. Okay. Or snow falling on the forest. That was another analogy that we find there. Okay. So now that brings us to number 5. The self does not possess the aggregates. And so, as Stephen pointed out, this analysis actually falls under both not inherently one and not inherently different. So the self does not possess the aggregates in the manner of, say, a person possessing his ear or her ear. Why? Because they would be inherently one, and then you have all the faults of being inherently one. And then the self does not possess the aggregates in the manner of a person possessing his car, her car, because they would be inherently other. And then you'd have all the faults that already accrued of being inherently different. Okay, so then that brings us to the 6th one. The mere collection of the aggregates is not the self. Mere collection of the aggregates is not the self. So can you remember some of the reasoning for, or the absurd consequences that come under this particular line of analysis? Stephen?
There would be no difference between the designated object and the basis of designation.
Right. There would be no difference between the designated object, the self, and the basis of designation. And so the Buddha was very clear that there was a distinction between these two. They're not the same. The mere collection is the basis of designation of the self, therefore it can't be one with the self. Otherwise, what would happen? You'd have an inherently existent self. Okay. So it's important for us to recognize this because the self and the aggregates are one entity. They're not inherently one entity. They are one entity, but they're not identical. They're one entity yet distinct. So if the mere collection of the aggregates was the self, they would have to be inherently one, which has already been refuted. In Meditation on Emptiness, Jeffrey has a nice section on this. It's pages 175 to 193. And he added a few more ideas under this point that I thought were interesting. Not that I completely understand them yet, but let's talk about them. Number 6, the mere collection. So under that section, or that point, he said, because the shapes of the individual parts cannot be a self, nor can the shape of the collection of the aggregates be a self, since it's impossible for the aggregates before or after arrangement to be the self. You might think, now wait, shape's coming next, but actually this was included under the collection of the aggregates not being the self. Okay? It says, because the shapes of the individual parts cannot be a self, nor can the shape of the collection of the aggregates be a self, since it is impossible for the aggregates before or after the collection to be a self. I wonder if this is getting at the idea that if the mere collection was the object, the designated object, then you could just have a bunch of parts. They're not in a collection or in a functioning unit yet. But if they're, like if we took this microphone apart and we had all the parts sitting up here on the desk, that's a collection of parts, but it's not the microphone yet because it's not pulled together and functioning. And labeled, yeah, and then labeled microphone, telephone, whatever it is. This object. Okay. So he says, just as the aggregates are not the self before being arranged as a self, they cannot be a self after arrangement. This is difficult with the self because we can't see the mind. It's easier when you talk about a telephone and you can actually take them apart, or a bicycle or a car or something like that. It's more difficult with the self because we can't isolate feeling over here and
But then I'm
discrimination.
thinking about this person, so if this person is a self.
Well, self, person, that's all referring to the same thing, isn't it? Those words are
With the
synonymous.
discrimination, the volitional factors,
Right.
the feelings, the aggregates, you can't kind of put them out and see them as parts independent from.
Yes, that's why I think it's more difficult for us to really understand this collection idea in relation to the self. But then we can go back to something like the chariot, or the bicycle, or the telephone, or the computer, whatever it is you can take apart, the Cuisinart, whatever parts. Okay, and then number 7, the 7th point of analysis. The self is not the mere shape of the collection of the aggregates, or the self is not the mere shape of the arrangement of the aggregates. What are the faults with this line of analysis? Or what are the absurd consequences that you'd run into?
Do we just go through that though, that the arrangement, that each of the parts is inherently different and separate than the self? So how can you put all of this individually unrelated parts in any type of particular arrangement and get something that isn't what it is anyway?
Well, the way I understand that is that, like we were talking about the telephone, we can take the telephone apart and put the parts up here. The parts, just because we have a collection of the parts, doesn't mean that that's a suitable basis for labeling, telephone. And each one of those parts is not the telephone. So, and the collection itself is not necessarily the telephone, certainly not inherently the telephone. Now, if we put those parts together and they function, then it can be dependently the telephone.
But not inherently.
Yeah. They're not the individual parts as well as the collection. The collection that's not assembled and functioning is not necessarily the telephone.
Right.
It's just it's a collection of parts.
Right. When it says arrangement, in my mind, it still says that the arrangement that's inherently unrelated, no matter what assortment it is before it gets put together. If it's not functioning before it gets arranged, and then you go ahead and arrange it, if it's inherently existent, it shouldn't change its relationship to what you're trying. You can't make it happen because they're unrelated across the board through the whole process.
Okay, so you're saying that we can apply that reasoning even to the shape, looking at the shape. Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right.
I don't see too much of a difference between that, except that there's an intention with the arrangement, but we're still talking about things that are totally inherently unrelated to the self. And no matter what form you put them in, they're still not going to have a relationship to each other because they're inherently different from each other.
Yeah. Okay, and also there are some other logic and lines of logic that we can draw on as
Yeah.
well.
There's only one aggregate that has shape.
That's right. So with the self, there's only one aggregate that has shape, and that's the form aggregate. So what would happen to the other because shape is physical, the consciousness couldn't be posited as a self, could it?
It may just be the way the wording is, I don't know, but since I would say shape of flesh, one thing like flesh and shape.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Also,
But that's true about the self.
Yeah.
Yeah.
also something that applies to the sixth one.
Mm-hmm.
And probably to the seventh. It's like the analogy that if you have 5 oranges, they can't be an apple if you make a collection. You can't take 5 not things that are not the self and make them the self.
Yeah, I think Venerable mentioned that during the teachings this last week. You can't take 5 things that are not the self and arrange them and make them the self.
It seems like there were 5, 6 ants.
Well, 7 is specifically about the shape. So if you were then talking about the shape of those 5 things, like Venerable Semke was suggesting, then maybe that would work. Okay.
It's really subtle in those 6 and 7s there.
Yeah.
Easy to see the first 5, but then get into the other ones. It's a little bit harder to parse them out.
When we studied this in looking at Lama Tsongkhapa's illumination of the thought, there were also a whole slew of line of reasoning that would spin your head out. Had to do with things being substantially existent or imputedly existent, and bringing in a lot of tenets too. So there, although we've hit the highlights, there's a lot more to think about and to look into with all of these 7 lines of analysis. Okay, so because the 5 or the 7 points can be condensed into the self and the aggregates not being inherently one or inherently different, then the Lamrim and thought training literature speak of 4 essential points that we use when we're meditating on the emptiness of the person. So we look at, first of all, identifying the object of negation, and then ascertaining the pervasion, that if the person existed inherently, it would have to exist either as inherently one or inherently different with its basis of designation, the aggregates. And then determining that they can't be inherently one or identical, and they can't be inherently different or separate. So the more we familiarize with this 7-point analysis or the 5-point analysis, then slowly we can come to a conclusion that the person does not inherently exist and is empty of inherent existence. From our own experience, you might think, how do these lines of logic actually transform into an actual experience? And so this is something to discover, isn't it? That by familiarizing with these lines of logic, that something does begin to dawn to the mind about how the self can exist and doesn't exist. And also keeping in mind, even though we can come to that conclusion, that we're not losing the self, we're not losing the chariot. The self is imputed independence upon the aggregates. That still stands. But the self is not inherently existent. So there's a nice, as I mentioned, there's a nice section in Meditation on Emptiness. And also in the Lamrim Chimo, there's a very extensive section, in Volume 3, page 277 to 288, if you want to look into that further. Yes, in Meditation on Emptiness, page 175 to 193. There's also a short section in the book we were just looking at, Buddhism, One Teacher, Many Traditions. There's a page or so on it. Okay, so that's number 11. Anything else about... That's pretty straightforward, wasn't it? So it's all good and well to put it up on the board and to collectively come up with some some ideas, but it's good to review these and think about them in your mind. See if you can call up at least 1 or 2 lines of logic for each one of them, and really try to thoroughly understand why it is the case, and try to hang on to those. And then to apply them to different things, not only the self and the aggregates, or if the self being inherently, if the self inherently existed, it would have to exist in one of these ways. Actually, that's true of anything that inherently existed. It would have to either be inherently one, or inherently different from its basis of designation. So we can analyze all sorts of things. Okay, anything else on that one?
Did we really go over 4 as far as the
Just looking at the analogies. That's the one of the yogurt in the bowl. The bowl is the self, and then the yogurt it represents the aggregates. So the aggregates do not inherently exist in, the yogurt doesn't inherently exist in the bowl. It's like they would be unrelated, wouldn't they? So they'd have to be separate, like yogurt in a bowl.
Yeah, I have to physicalize these to think about them. Because the lion in the forest one just drove me crazy for a long time trying to figure out what that meant.
Sounds to me that snow in the forest?
The snow pervades the forest, covers it, yeah. The forest would be like the self, and then the snow is falling on it. So the aggregates do not inherently depend on the self. They're covering the self.
Should for using mayonnaise on bread too. This is nice.
Mayonnaise on bread. Okay, whatever works for you. Yogurt in a bowl, mayonnaise on bread.
What do you say about the one with the lion in the forest?
It just took me a long time to figure it out what that meant. And that's the lion wandering inside the forest. Like, how is the lion depending on the forest? That analogy, the dependency part didn't ever click.
Yeah.
That's number 3,
Key
right?
habitat.
Yeah, number 3. So how did you conclude that?
Well, I mean, Venerable talks about it a lot. So more it was like the idea of like this little minnow moving around inside. It's probably more of like a self-sufficient, substantially existent self that I have in mind when I think of that. But still, it's more like this little being lying around on the side of the forest. That's how I figure it out.
So the aggregates are like the bigger container, the forest, and there's the self.
Isolates inside.
Right, so the self does not inherently exist in or depend on the aggregates. It can exist independently,
Yeah.
but not inherently. Yeah.
To me, that one feels intuitive, because sometimes when you're doing these meditations, the 4-point analysis,
Yeah.
you're sitting there and you have all your body there, and you have this sense of me.
Uh-huh.
And here I am,
Uh-huh.
but you've just talked about every part of your body and your mind, but here I am. And so it feels like there's this little lion roaming around in these aggregates, like it's just, there's this little me just roaming around and all.
Sitting behind the eyes and organizing everything.
Yeah, that one
Yeah.
actually
Yeah,
makes a lot of
my
sense.
knee is more like mayonnaise on bread.
But you can search the forest to not.
I think Venerable used peanut butter on her bread during the last
That one I
teachings.
find harder. That one, self-covering, the aggregates covering themselves.
What's interesting, in Jeffrey, in His Holiness's book, How to See Yourself as You Really Are, and it gives all those examples for investigating the object of negation. And what's fascinating, I found, at least in the limited experience I had with that, is that when the mind is really quiet and you can have more of awareness of each of those different situations, then it's fascinating how the I does appear very differently. When we're meditating, probably there's one presentation that we relate to most frequently. Like, for me, it's like there's someone behind the eyes and it's organizing everything and looking out through the eyes. The controller. Yeah. But there are certain situations where it feels like the I is outside of even the aggregates.
In that analogy, the snow is the self covering the aggregates, which is the forest.
Yeah.
That, okay, so that kind of makes sense. Like I've got this body and mind here, and then there's this
Something bigger than the
aura
self.
of self that's enclosing it,
Holding it all together.
pulling it all together. It's harder for me to get that one.
Yeah, that may not be the most dominant feeling that you have when the self appears and you can have a moment of awareness to look at it.
Oh, maybe if I thought about when I was angry, and there's just this all-enclosing self that.
It's very big.
Over it.
Okay.
Maybe that. Thank you.
All right. So obviously there's a lot to think about and investigate and identify. First of all, I mean, all of these, it goes without saying that we have to identify the object of negation first. And so how do we do that? I don't know the page number in Jeffrey's book. Jeffrey translated His Holiness's teachings, How to See Yourself as You Really Are, but that, I've found that to be quite useful. So if you want some additional support on how to identify the object of negation, that's a good book to look into. Okay, let's look at number 12. How does Nagarjuna refute inherently existent phenomena? Update the refutation using the periodic table rather than 4 elements. Okay.
All the scientists in the room, did you?
Well, it's been a while since I've studied the periodic table, but let's see what we come up with.
Can you rewrite it?
What's that?
Can you rewrite the verse?
I did. Yeah. Okay, so I came up with a couple of different things here.
Which verse is it?
Well, I thought it related to verse 83. Is that what you thought?
83 through 90.
Yes. 83 through 90 actually are talking about similar, yeah. What did you think? 80. Okay. I think I saved them for the next one.
Yes,
Oh.
I didn't put with the periodic table. I did it for the next one. I didn't do it for the periodic table. I did it for number 13.
Okay.
Couldn't-
Just a
I would
minute,
take
let
the
me-
periodic table and use it
Let me, let me just, my computer quit today and I'm pulling up the auto-saved version of these notes. See what I had. No, you're right. I went back to verse 80 and 81. At first I thought it was 83. So this is my line of thinking. Let's see what if your line of thinking is similar or different. So in verse 80 we're investigating selflessness of person. And then in the next few verses, he begins to focus on selflessness of phenomena. So the analysis is similar to before. It centers on determining if things are inherently one or inherently different. So verse 80, the person is not earth, not water, not fire, not wind, not space, not consciousness, not all of them together. What person is there other than these? So that's clearly talking about selflessness of person. But notice the next line. He says, just as the person is not real due to being a composite of the 6 constituents, so each constituent also is not real due to being a composite. Okay. So having refuted the inherent existence of the person, just in case we think that its constituent parts exist inherently, then Nagarjuna refutes that as well.
So where's the periodic table?
Just a minute, it's coming. It's coming. All right, so here he's using the analogy of the elements. And we spoke about this last time when we were looking at the previous questions, that as Jeffrey says in Meditation on Emptiness, the particles that serve as the basis for the construction of physical objects are aggregates or aggregations of the 8 substances. Remember this? So earth, water, fire, wind, also visible form, odor, taste, and tangible objects arisen from the elements. It's a very ancient approach to physics in the day when they didn't have electron microscopes and things like this. So it says that sound is not included because it doesn't have a continuum of a similar type. So I'm not 100% sure what that means. Do you have an idea of what that actually means, Venerable Tarpa? Because you pointed it out.
It goes out of existence.
Sound goes out of existence.
And I think the other things do. Is what happens. Sound waves are pressure waves.
We talked about that.
Years ago, this whole thing about why sound is included
Okay.
in that. Nothing to.
All right, so Venerable Tarpa is suggesting that because sound waves are like pressure waves on the eardrum and they go out of existence, seems like there would be some residue to them. You know, that nothing just vanishes. There would be some result of the sound waves.
But the other ones, you are in contact with some sort of external object with your eyes, your nose, your touch,
Okay.
and your
Well,
smell.
what about the sound waves?
That's what I'm saying,
There's a
that the sound
physicality.
doesn't have
Well,
a-
there- sound is vibration.
Vibration.
And at a certain point, those vibrations cease.
Okay.
The other ones have to have.
Light is vibrations too, and you can visualize based on that.
Now we're out of my pay grade. It's been too long since I...
Like, I really understand the sound.
Any scientists in the room? Okay, so anyway, we have these 8 atomic substances.
Like, the only thing I can think of is that sound, I don't think is electromagnetic radiation. I think it might-
And light is?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
so, yeah, that's as far as it.
All right, we'll keep
I
that.
think of a guitar string, it stops moving.
All right. We might just hold that as a doubt for a scholar in science of some kind. There are these 8 atomic substances, the 4 elemental particles, earth, water, fire, wind, and the 4 elemental derivatives, or sometimes they're called evolutes. Okay, so for example, the earth element doesn't inherently exist because it arises in dependence upon the collection of its parts, just like the self doesn't exist inherently because it depends upon these elements. The earth element can't be found in any of its parts individually, any of those 8 parts. Can't be found in the collection of its parts as a whole or in the continuity of its parts, nor is it separate from its bases of designation, the other parts. So what other earth element could there be? There's no inherent earth element. So if we update the refutation using the periodic table rather than the 4 elements, I looked up the constituents of the body, and actually the body is 65% oxygen, 18.5% carbon, 9.5% hydrogen, and 3% nitrogen, and 4% a mixture. So, oh sure, 65% oxygen. I always thought the body was mostly water.
Hydrogen and oxygen.
Well, but there's not as much, it doesn't come out mathematically. 65% oxygen, 18.5% carbon.
There's a lot of CH, there's a lot of ecology and all that stuff. There's a lot of oxygen, molecules of carbon molecules.
9.5% hydrogen. If you have to have 2 of those, so 19% of the oxygen goes with the hydrogen. That still leaves a lot of oxygen. And then 3% nitrogen. And 4% is a mixture of various chemical substances.
Oh, we had huge calcium.
That's part of the 4%. Interesting, huh?
I've heard it by weight, probably is not more oxygen.
So we could rephrase verse 80 and 81 to say, the person is not oxygen, not carbon, not hydrogen, not nitrogen, not the mixture of the others, not consciousness, not all of them together. What person is there other than these? How's that? Is that going to fly? Is that, what did you come up with?
Well, see, the thing is, I took mine from Wikipedia.
Okay.
They said that 99% of the mass of the body is 6 elements. And then they had 0.85% is 5 elements, and then there's about a little more than a dozen trace elements, so you're up to about 20. So I wrote the first verse a lot like yours,
Okay.
but then the second one changed.
All right. And then 81 is just as the person is not real due to being a composite of various chemical elements, so each chemical element also is not real due to being a composite.
Mine was, this is a person that's not real due to being a composite of 6 main elements, 5 more minor elements, and a dozen trace elements. So too is each of the elements not real due to being a composite of protons, neutrons, and electrons, and other
Well done, Venerable Tarpa. What did, okay. Anyone else have a different answer?
I never thought that's what that question was asking.
Well, who actually knows what the real answer is, but
No,
this is,
just the fact that you tracked the fact that Venerable just wanted you to change the way the refutation ran using the periodic table. I didn't even see that. Okay, that was great. All right. That's why I didn't answer.
so first we examine the different elements that are the basis of designation of the form aggregate. I mean, we included consciousness too, but the form aggregate to see if they exist inherently. Then we do the same for the chemical elements themselves, which is really interesting. I mean, I don't remember the configurations of, but if you think about it, so let's say oxygen, for instance, it can be, all of these are going to be, they're going to be atomic, right? So there'll be a nucleus and different numbers of electrons and protons and neutrons circling around them to make them the unique chemical element that they are. So those are a basis of designation for each one of these elemental compounds or elemental substances. So having done that, then we can conclude that the form aggregate, the different chemical elements that are the basis of the form aggregate, and the elements themselves do not exist inherently. Good enough?
None of those elements are a self.
None of those elements are a self. Right. And none of those chemical elements are inherently one with the body. None of those chemical elements are inherently different from the body. Okay. Number 13. Describe the refutation of inherently existent phenomena using the four elements as Nagarjuna does. So this is where I drew on verse 83. Is that similar? The other three elements are not earth, nor are they in earth, nor is the earth in them, but without them the earth element cannot exist. Such is also the case for each of the other elements. Therefore, as with the self, the elements are unreal. So, although, that's okay. Describe the refutation of inherently existent phenomena using the four elements as Nagarjuna does. So, in this schema, it said that the four elements that compose the form aggregate are mutually the basis of each other. And that's very different than, say, these chemical compounds. I don't think we'd say the chemical compounds each are relying on each other in the same way that was described with these 8 subtle particles.
They rely on each other to make the molecules, to make the cells and such. So.
Yes, but in a different way, I think, than the 8 particles that make up each and every, that come together, aggregate to actually form a different compound or element. Okay. So, like in that system, then the earth element, for example, has all the other elements complete with it, but it's not inherently one with them. It possesses the other 3, but not inherently. And I think we mentioned this last time, that the fact that stone or wood or things like that hold together indicates the presence of the water element. It's an interesting way to think about it, isn't it? That adhesiveness or cohesiveness is the water element. The fact that stones and trees move indicate the presence of air element in that earth element. So I don't know a lot about this system. I think we could, maybe not throw it out completely, but to say probably the atomic explanation of things is one that we're more familiar with in our present day and age.
In our present day and age too, if you take,
Speak up, please, so
if
that.
you take any of the elements from the periodic table and you were to look at their electrons, each has electrons that don't differ from the others, don't they? I mean, if they have a certain amount of electrons and a certain amount of neutrons, do those vary? You can't, is an electron that's in an oxygen molecule different than an electron in a hydrogen molecule? I could be wrong, but they are.
In chemistry, all we learned about was that they're negative
you'd be breaking down electron from any element. You're finding these quirks and whatever you're, I don't think one varies from.
Okay, well, it's an interesting idea. Can you bring us a source next week?
I guess.
Okay, good. Okay. And then moving on to the next question, number 14. Do the aggregates exist inherently? If they don't, how can they be the basis of designation for the self? And if they do, how can they be the basis of designation for the self? So it seems to me that this is a broad brush question. I couldn't find anything specifically that I could put my finger on. But it seems like in these verses from 80, all the way from 81 to 99, then Nagarjuna establishes this non-inherent existence of conditioned things. That's really what he's focusing on first. So looking at the aggregates, the elements, and their derivatives. So he first showed that there was no inherently existent person. Then he analyzed the components of the body, the four elements, or as we've said, these different chemical components. In the same way, these elements or chemical components, or you could even say the aggregates, which are part of the basis of designation of the person, do not exist inherently because they don't exist in any of the four ways. So like the person, the four elements are not real. The mind that grasps them as inherently existent is erroneous. We can analyze the aggregates as the basis of designation of the person in the same way. Is that making any sense? These are my notes. So just as the person and the aggregates, the designated object and the basis of designation, are mutually reliant on each other, I think that's really what's the important aspect of this question.
Yeah.
They are mutually reliant. This is something that's unique to the middle way consequent school. I mean, all the other schools would accept, I think all the other schools would accept this idea, at least mine only a middle way autonomy, would accept that there is mutual dependence, but they could not go the next step and use mutual dependence as a way of refuting inherent existence like the consequent school does. Let me just read some of the notes that I made under this particular question. I was looking at verse 88. If those elements each exist on its own, how could they exist mutually? And if they do not exist on their own, how could they exist mutually? That seemed to be the verse that was closest to the question, even though her question is about the aggregates. Okay, so how I was thinking about this is that all Buddhist tenet schools agree on what it means to be inherently existent. That if you look for what is conventionally imputed, you can find an illustration among the basis of designation. The difference is that for middle way autonomy and below, they say things do inherently exist. And for the consequent school, they say that nothing inherently exists. So under verse 88, then, someone might say, although the elements rely on each other, or we could say, although the aggregates rely on each other, the entity of each element or the entity of each aggregate exists inherently. And that's actually what is, I don't know if the lower schools actually say this or this is something, a position that's forced upon them. But for instance, middle way autonomy school, I don't want to confuse something that's imputedly existent with something that is extant. I think that's why I stopped going in that direction. Okay, there's a difference between, at least for the lower schools, between something being imputedly existent, like that they say that the person is imputedly existent, but that the aggregates substantially exist. For the consequent school, they say substantial existence and inherent existence are the same thing. They're talking about the same object of negation, but that's not true necessarily for the lower schools. So I might be creating a little problem for myself there. The lower systems cannot accept that the four elements are not mutually reliant. So they can't accept that those four elements are not mutually reliant. They're asserting this whole schema, this physics schema, that the four elements are mutually reliant, that they depend on each other. They come together, in each small particle. Therefore, if they're going to hang on to that, then they have to give up the assertion that the four elements are inherently existent.
Is that true for the Chittamatra school? No.
Mostly, in my memory, it's talked about in relation to the Middle Way Autonomy School. So why do you think it wouldn't hold for the mind-only school, the Chittamatras? I don't remember.
Well, it's the issue of all external objects, right? So what they hold as being inherently existent is the mind, not the
No, they assert that anything that exists, they equate existence with inherent existence. They say that other powered phenomena, thoroughly imputed phenomena, and what's the other one? Thoroughly established phenomena. All of those inherently exist.
Really?
Mhm.
Just two.
I thought it was just, maybe two, but I have to go back and look. I'm not like any kind of expert.
Only two of them truly exist, but all of them inherently exist and exist by way of their own character. All of them truly exist, and all of them exist from their own side, according to their understanding of those terms.
They don't refute any inherent existence.
No,
Just-
they don't refute any inherent existence. But I don't remember, okay, so although they say that both the consciousness, the apprehending consciousness and the object that's apprehended arise from the same latency, they still assert that there is, they don't assert external objects, but matter exists. Is that how we'd say it? They're not saying that no matter exists or no form exists. So how they would actually describe form and matter, I don't know. And again, we'd have to really investigate, is that something that they actually assert, or is that something that's forced upon them because of other, like this idea that all things inherently exist? I don't know. Okay. So maybe just to emphasize, there's a difference in subtlety or profundity with respect to the understanding of mutual dependency across the different schools of thought, that the lower schools accept mutual dependency but can't use that as a reason for refuting inherent existence. Only the middle way consequent school uses the reason of mutual dependency in order to refute inherent existence. So I was trying to make these connections and I ran out of time.
Only the middle way consequent school even bothers to refute inherent existence.
True. Because things depend, they don't inherently exist. Anything that inherently...
Using it as a reasoning, they
Yes,
do that.
using it in combination with the king of reasonings, dependent arising. So for instance, an I consciousness and the object it realizes mutually depend on each other. So just the mere fact that an object exists validates the fact that there's a consciousness realizing that object. I think that's one of the lines of reasonings they use to refute self-cognizers. That you don't need a self-cognizer because if you have an object, you have a consciousness that's knowing that object. Okay, so the elements do exist on their own? On their own, what does that mean? The elements do exist. If the elements did not exist, they would be mixed and could not be, okay, so they have like their own entity. I think that's what it's getting at. They would be mixed and could not be distinguished individually. In that case, they could not be mutually reliant. They must be conventionally different or distinct, but not inherently different, in order to depend on each other. If that means anything?
Not each exist on their own.
Yeah,
They would be mixed and could not be distinguished individually.
right.
And I lost track, what is that for the thing?
Yes, what does that prove? Okay, so we're looking at verse 88. If those elements each exist on its own, how could they exist mutually? So
I see.
exist on its own, is that, how do you understand that? Is that existing inherently? Independently, okay.
Translation says individually.
Oh. uh-huh.
Individually distinguished from individual.
They each exist, themselves exist individually.
I see it as delivered in an unrelated fashion.
Not dependently, independently. Okay. Is that the verse that others pulled out for answering number 14? Okay. So the designated object and the basis of designation are mutually dependent. And because they're mutually dependent, then neither one of them can be inherently existent. Neither the imputed phenomena or the basis of designation. Okay, so because the question was, if the aggregates don't exist inherently, how can they be the basis of designation for the self? Again, I think it's distinguishing the lower school's position with the consequent school. And so because they, what did we say? Because they exist in mutual dependency, they can't exist, neither one of them can exist inherently. Otherwise, they couldn't be in that mutual dependency. We're probably grossly understating something that is so important. But that's about all I can do with that one right now, unless someone else has something to add.
I guess you take Chuck as a nice summary.
Great.
To answer this question.
Okay.
This is from Insight into Emptiness.
Do you remember the papers?
To get it for it later. So he says, when we search the basis of designation to find a person, we don't find anything. Whether we search in the aggregates, the constituents, the elements, or the elemental derivatives, no person can be found. Although the person depends on all of these, it is not any of them individually, nor is it the collection as a whole. The person is also not found separate from these.
Okay, there we go. Yes?
Can we say that the designated object and basis of designation are one?
Yes. They are one entity. They're distinct and they are not known, they're not seen separately by one valid consciousness. That's not an exact definition of one entity, but that's the meaning.
And the last question. If they do, how could they be the basis of designation for the self? That's a good question. If they do.
If they do inherently exist, how can they be the basis of designation for the self? Can they be? They can't be. They can't. Anything that's inherently existent can't depend on anything, can't be a basis for anything. In fact, we couldn't even know it if it existed.
I was thinking more from the line of like things that are inherently existent have to be permanent. That means the aggregates have to be permanent. That could consider being permanent.
That's true also. Okay.
Now used impermanence as part of the refutation on how aggregates could exist inherently.
Because the aggregates are impermanent. Uh-huh.
As is the self.
Okay. Anything else? Good, we got through 4 questions. How about that?